Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is journalist Rania Khalek. Rania, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
So there has been a lot happening in the Middle East recently. I feel like I've been talking about Israel and Gaza for a long, long time, and now Lebanon has come into the mix as well. Recently, you were on Piers Morgan's show on a panel debate discussion there, and there was something that you said that really stood out to me when you brought up Hezbollah, and you mentioned the occupation, and I want to get into that a little bit more. Can you talk a little bit about the formation of Hezbollah and the occupation in Lebanon by Israel?
Yeah, so obviously, I think a lot of people have learned a lot about Palestine over the last year because of the genocide in Gaza, which is fantastic. Lebanon probably seems a lot more complicated because it's not, as clear cut. It's a bit more, and it's a country, right? Palestine is occupied territories that Israel's been trying to steal since its inception, whereas Lebanon is this country that has its own political structure, and it can seem kind of confusing. But I do live in Lebanon. I am Lebanese American, and I can simplify it for people. Back in the day, just to make it super, super simple, when the French and the British, before like their empires fell, they, much like they did in places like Africa, they went into the Middle East and they carved it up and they created borders. And one of the countries they created is called Lebanon. And Lebanon was actually supposed to be this like Christian state that was supposed to go along with like a Jewish state of Israel. It didn't quite work out that way because Lebanon is very socially diverse. It has a lot of sects. There's a lot of Muslims, Shias, and Sunnis. There's Christians, there's Druze, there's other minority sects as well. And so it didn't quite work out. And Israel also has always had this plan for greater Israel. So yeah, it got the territories of Palestine, and it's still been trying to encroach more and more and annex more of that and steal more of that land. But it's always had this vision for actually taking a part of Lebanon, taking a part of Syria, taking a part of Iraq, and this like greater Israel sort of colonial plan. So actually, Israel does still occupy a little part of Lebanon called the Shebaa Farms, still occupies the Golan Heights, which is actually Syrian territory, and it has expansionist aims for more. So that's just kind of a broader background. But to bring it more to like what's happening today, I mean, Lebanon has a history of being interfered with, invaded, and occupied by Israel. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978 during the civil war in Lebanon. That civil war can seem really complicated, but it has different portions that happened. Initially, it was kind of a war on the Arab left that existed in large part inside Lebanon. It was a war on the Palestinian resistance movements as well. And the U.S., the Israelis, and the French actually funded and armed fascist proxies in Lebanon that carried out a lot of massacres during the Lebanese Civil War, which is probably something people don't really understand or know about. And that was, first invasion from the Israelis specifically is 1978. Then they invade again in 1982. And this invasion was significantly more brutal. And it led to the Israelis not just invading the South, but actually they made their way all the way up to Beirut. They even made their way into my family's village. And they destroyed or tried to destroy my grandmother's house. So I have my own like experience, at least my family does, with the Israelis in that sense. But in 1982, they invaded Lebanon. They bombed the hell out of Beirut. They placed a siege on Beirut. They killed tens of thousands of people in the course of just a few months. And it got so vicious that at one point, and you probably saw me say this in my Piers Morgan interview, Ronald Reagan had to call up the Israeli prime minister and say, dude, you need to stop. And he called what was happening in Lebanon a Holocaust. And you can go look up that exchange. Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, actually laughed at Ronald Reagan and was like, I think we know what a Holocaust looks like. And he was like, no, I'm serious. You need to stop. And within 20 minutes, the Israelis stopped. So that just shows you the actual American power that exists when it comes to Israel if they choose to use it. But anyways, the 1982 invasion was really brutal. You can read books about it. Robert Fisk wrote a really good one, who's the late Robert Fisk. But there's also a really good book called Beware of Small States about the Lebanese Civil War that explains some of what the Israelis did. But all that's to say the Israelis invaded and then they never left. They actually ended up occupying a big portion of southern Lebanon. And that occupation lasted until the year 2000. So southern Lebanon is mostly Lebanese Shias. It's got other, sects in it, but it's majority Shia, like Shia Muslim. And so a lot of people whose villages were occupied come from this sect, and they formed a group in the mid 80s to fight back against these invaders and occupiers who were encroaching on their land, had invaded their land, were occupying their land, had set up torture facilities, funded a Lebanese proxy group called the South Lebanon Army to carry out horrors across the South on their behalf. So that's when Hezbollah forms in the mid 1980s. It's a Lebanese like Shia group that has a military wing and now a political wing. But it was basically Lebanese farmers in the South taking up arms to fight their invaders. That is where Hezbollah comes from. And they fought Israel up until the year 2000 when the losses, it was a guerrilla war. The losses became too much for Israel to continue to withstand. And so they forced the Israelis to withdraw. And that was the first time any Arab military force of any kind, whether state or non-state actor, has managed to liberate Arab land from the Israelis. So it was like a huge victory across the region. And then the Israelis weren't finished yet. They've always been upset about that. So they again invaded Lebanon in 2006 and fought a brutal 33-day war with Hezbollah, with all of Lebanon, really. And they killed like 1,300 people. And they also lost a lot of their own soldiers. And because the losses were so heavy and they weren't able to actually properly invade because Hezbollah put up such a fierce resistance, they once again were forced to withdraw, and it was seen as a victory for Hezbollah and the resistance axis, what we now call the resistance axis, and a loss for Israel. And so it's been, 18 years since that invasion? And now we see Israel invading once again. And we can talk a little bit more about what's happened more recently, but I just think it's important to understand that context and background about Lebanon, because Lebanon has had to face repeated acts of nonstop Israeli aggression. I mean, even in the last 18 years before the genocide in Gaza, Israel has basically violated Lebanese airspace 22,000 times with overflights, where they're just collecting intelligence, scaring the Lebanese. It's actually psychologically really scary when you have Israeli fighter jets and drones in your airspace whenever they feel like it. And sometimes they use Lebanese airspace to bomb Syria. And all that time, too, the U.S. and Israel, they haven't reinvaded until now, but they've definitely played a role constantly trying to destabilize Lebanon through proxies, trying to push Hezbollah out of government through local actors, trying to disarm Hezbollah through local actors, trying to cause civil unrest through their local proxies. And it hasn't worked, but it's definitely left the country in a very precarious and weak situation where they had an economic collapse that was the result of a banking system that was like a pyramid scheme that essentially was backed by the US until it wasn't, to try to basically choke Hezbollah. So that's everything before October 7th. And then October 7th happens, and you can feel free to butt in from there, because now I'm just rambling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for people to understand the history, because the West is very quick to label certain groups as a terrorist organization. And a lot of Americans just go along with it. I think it's a little bit different when it comes to Gaza, though, because people have educated themselves about the occupation of the Palestinian people. But now when we go to Lebanon, I'm realizing, again, a lot of Americans just are not aware and are more likely to believe the propaganda from corporate media. Israel killed Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, and from what I understand, and feel free to let me know how you feel about this. From what I have been told by Lebanese Americans here in the U.S., is that he was considered to be like a Malcolm X figure in Lebanon, and that he's greatly missed. And the way that the West describes him is that he was this brutal, like terrorist. Who also killed his own people. And I want to hear a little bit more about that from you. Like, how do people view him in Lebanon?
So Lebanon's a really polarized society. There are people who are probably very happy in Lebanon that this guy's gone. His political opponents, for example. There are literally fascist parties, right-wing parties in Lebanon that the U.S. backs, that hate Nasrallah. They're thrilled he's been killed, because that basically it's Israel taking out their political enemies. These are people who want to normalize with Israel, they hate Palestinians, they hate Syrians, they hate Lebanese Shias. That mentality does exist in Lebanon. I like to think it's a minority view. But of course, if you're going to get a Lebanese viewpoint about what the Americans and the Israelis did over the last couple of weeks, that one might be the one that's given airtime on Fox News for sure, but also CNN, right? But yeah, a significant chunk of Lebanese are supportive of Hezbollah. In fact, Hezbollah is a part of the largest political bloc in the Lebanese parliament. This is not just a non-state military actor. This is also a political party that has members of parliament on a political side. And there was elections just in Lebanon in 2022, and Hezbollah did great. They won like 13 seats. And again, they're a part of the biggest political bloc. So they're aligned with these other large political parties that also democratically won their seats. Lebanon also has, I don't need to get into like the specifics of this because people are just going to not, it's like too specific, but Lebanon has like a kind of gerrymandering system where certain people's votes count significantly more than other people's votes. So actually, if Lebanon had a more democratic system, you'd have more members of parliament from Hezbollah. But because the votes of people who live in Hezbollah areas don't count as much as, let's say, votes in like certain Christian areas that might be like pro-Lebanese forces, which is a party that's aligned with the US, it's like not actually as democratic as it should be. But the point is, U.S. says they love democracy. Hezbollah has members of parliament that are democratically elected to government and are a part of the majority political bloc in government. So this is not just a military organization Israel's going after. I also just want to mention something before I explain a little bit more about Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, because people hear this talking point a lot, is the Americans, like you saw that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris issued these statements calling it justice to kill Hassan Nasrallah. And basically any person in a senior leadership of Hezbollah, they always say it's good that they died or were killed and that it was justice. The reason they use the word justice is because in the 1980s, the early 1980s, the U.S. under Ronald Reagan deployed U.S. Marines to Lebanon in the midst of the civil war to help the Israelis and to help their fascist proxies who were committing massacres. So there was a bombing attack against the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon that killed something like 200 and some odd U.S. Marines. And so the U.S. calls this a terrorist attack, which shows you how meaningless that term is, because it's the opposite of a terrorist attack to hit a military target of an invading military force in your country. You can say what you want. You can disagree with that. You can be upset American soldiers died, though you should be upset at Ronald Reagan for sending American soldiers into somebody else's country in the middle of a civil war. But the U.S. every year marks that day. Even the U.S. Embassy in Beirut does, is like the most U.S. military personnel ever killed in a single attack, and Hezbollah must pay. And so it's just so absurd. I mean, it was kind of the precursor of Hezbollah that's believed to have carried out that attack. But also, what the hell were you doing in Lebanon? And then to sit there and act like Hezbollah just massacred a bunch of like helpless American babies or something, when it was Marines who, again, actively became participants in a civil war in another country, that they're legitimate. That's like the definition of a legitimate military target, is completely absurd. But to fast forward to Nasrallah, Nasrallah took over Hezbollah as their secretary general in the early 1990s. And he had been in charge since then. And he was a very smart guy. Like, you can go, I'm sure now people are looking and seeing clips of his speeches online with English subtitles. The guy was politically savvy. He was ideologically really smart. Obviously, he's, I don't agree with the whole Islamist ideology. I'm not a religious person. I'm a secular leftist. But, the way he understood the world, the way he understood imperialism, the way he understood Israel was very much in line with the way you or I would think about these things. Moreover, he was revered by his community as being a protector of southern Lebanon, of protecting Lebanon's territorial integrity from the Israelis, and later during the war in Syria, protecting Lebanon from al-Qaeda and ISIS and various other Salafi jihadist groups that were receiving support from the U.S. and various Gulf states to overthrow the Syrian government. They posed a huge security threat to Lebanon, which is why Hezbollah involved itself in that war. All that's to say, this guy also had he was a very Chavez-like figure in Lebanon, particularly for the Lebanese Shia community, but also anybody who's pro-resistance. This guy would give a speech and the world would stop and watch his speeches, including, U.S. officials would watch his speeches because of how important and powerful Hezbollah is and how much what he says matters. Europeans would watch his speeches for the same reason, but also people across the region who are pro-resistance against imperialism would watch this guy's speeches, and they were kind of a way to, like, same like with Chavez speeches, They were like, he's very charismatic and kind of funny, but also it would be educational. And also he would explain what's happening in the region, what's happening in this or that conflict, either internally or externally, what we're doing about it and why we should support this or that. And so, you know, the loss of Nasrallah is huge because of this. This wasn't just some terrorist. I mean, if you read it's really sick. If you read any headline, it's like the US just took out some terrorist that killed a bunch of American service members. No, they took out the leader of a Lebanese political party that also is only recognized as terrorists by the US, UK, and Europe. That is not the world. The rest of the world, which is the majority of the world, the significant majority of the world, sees Hezbollah as a legitimate representation of a segment of the Lebanese population that serves in politics, that serves in the country's government, and they deal with them as such. So even and also when we talk about Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, who are they committing terrorism against? Like, has Hezbollah ever invaded the US or committed a bombing in the US? Like, the US is constantly comparing them to ISIS and Al Qaeda. That is just completely false. If anything, Hezbollah fought ISIS and Al Qaeda, and the US funded at least Al Qaeda in Syria. And so at the end of the day, like this is all just a weaponized term to try to suffocate a group of people that are really good at fighting Israel, to try to rig the system in the Middle East to Israel's benefit and therefore to America's benefit.
And then we fast forward to the walkie-talkie explosion and the pager explosion as well. That was very scary to see because regardless if you live in Lebanon or not, the fact that Israel could do that and kill so many civilians. And again, it's very disturbing. Western corporate media is just constantly trying to find a way to defend Israel over and over again, regardless of the actions that they do. But I want to hear a little bit more about those explosions as well, because the way that they described it, the way that corporate media described it was that Israel had those pagers, but it was a direct target. Obviously, from what I saw, that doesn't appear to be the case.
No, and just before I talk about the pagers, I just really want to quickly, because what people are hearing from the Israelis is that they had no choice but to start attacking Hezbollah like this and Lebanon like this, because they've been firing rockets at us unprovoked since October 8th. And so I just want to point out, it is true. On October 8th, Hezbollah started firing at Israeli military installations. But the first strike was not on what's considered Israel. The first strike was at an Israeli military installation in an area called the Sabah Farms. The Sabah Farms is Lebanese occupied land. Israel, it's land that belongs to Lebanon, although some people might argue it belongs to Syria, but everyone, Syria, Lebanon say it belongs to Lebanon. That is occupied by Israel. So their first firing wasn't at some northern Israeli settlement. It was at a Israeli military installation on Lebanese occupied, like Israeli occupied land that belongs to Lebanon. So I just want to make that clear. And then after that, it became a tit for tat. Why did Hezbollah do that? Because Israel started committing a genocide in Gaza. And Hezbollah intervened against that genocide out of moral reasons, out of moral conviction, because that's what you should do against the genocide, right? You should intervene and do everything in your power to stop it. No one else is. That's one. But two, Israel doesn't see Palestine as necessarily separate from Lebanon. And there was a view from Hezbollah that the Israelis would, if they carry out the elimination of Hamas in Gaza and destroy Gaza, everyone knows Lebanon is next. So you got to get ahead of this. That was the view. And there can be arguments about whether that was wise or not. And people are having those discussions, and that's fine. I tend to disagree with those who are against what Hezbollah did, but that's like a fair discussion to have. But regardless, they intervened on October 8th. And since then, there was a tit for tat between Hezbollah and the Israelis that was largely limited to the border areas on both sides of the border. But and that went on until about 3 weeks ago, until those pager attacks, which is when, I mean, there's been like kind of a tit for tat escalation with Israel always escalating, especially a couple months ago when they assassinated his senior Hezbollah military commander called Fuad Shukr. They did that like a day before they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. But 3 weeks ago, they really leveled up in terms of the escalation with those pager attacks. And so every media outlet was like, wow, Israeli ingenuity. This is so bold. What's bold? Well, Israel booby-trapped electronic communication devices and blew them up while people were going about their daily lives. So they turned human beings into IEDs, basically, into indiscriminate bombs to terrorize the population and to injure and maim people they view as Hezbollah. There were a lot of members of Hezbollah who had these pagers, but there was also other people. Like, again, Lebanon's a political party in Lebanon. Every political party in Lebanon has like a clientele system where they sort of take care of their community. So in areas where Hezbollah's voted in to be in charge, they're going to be the ones that are sort of like, you know, taking funding and running hospitals, or funding and running schools, and this is the case for every political party in Lebanon. So it wasn't just members of Hezbollah. Like, it wasn't like Hezbollah fighters just walking around with these pagers. It was also other people who like work in civil and sort of the civil administrative areas, and areas that, you know, Hezbollah runs things in. So this was an attack not on fighters on a battlefield. This was essentially an attack on people who were going about their civilian activities, and some of which were civilians. And it injured and maimed thousands of people. A lot of people lost their eyes, their hands. People died, including children. It was, by all intents and purposes, a terrorist attack. Ex-CIA director Leon Panetta, not exactly some raging like Palestinian liberation activist, went on TV and said there's no question this was a terrorist attack. A bunch of UN human rights experts came out and wrote a report saying this is a flagrant violation of international law. The only people defending it are Israel, which is run by a bunch of sociopathic, like genocidal maniacs, and the US, also run by the same kinds of people. All that's to say, after that, Israel then went on to start flattening entire residential buildings in an area of Beirut called Dahieh. It's like in the southern suburb of Beirut. And this is where it's like a Hezbollah, like, you know, Hezbollah's like elected there, right? So like it's all called a Hezbollah stronghold. But it's just an area where like people live, just like where I live in Lebanon, that happens to be like where Hezbollah has a base of support. And so Israel started flattening residential buildings, and then eventually, you know, started carpet bombing areas of Lebanon, killing hundreds of people a day. I mean, it's just been horrifying to watch. And then it culminated into what we saw last week with Israel dropping 85 bunker buster bombs that are 2,000 pounds supplied to them by the US to basically turn 6 residential buildings into ash to kill Hassan Nasrallah. Something else that the media was like, wow, the Israelis are so ingenious and good at spycraft. They kill Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, give anybody 85 bunker buster bombs, and I think they can kill like anybody they know is in a certain radius. It doesn't like make them special, other than the only thing that makes them special, I guess, is their willingness to like carry out a really depraved, immoral act of just violates every international norm ever.
But what it does show you is that if Israel could specifically target certain leaders in Lebanon, then they also could have done that with Hamas. And it shows you, and I hope this pulls the cover off for people who were saying, well, Hamas is hiding behind the people and they're using them as human shields. I hope this wakes up people who held that conclusion, because I said, well, that just goes to show you that if Israeli intelligence can specifically target certain leaders in Lebanon, they could have done the same thing in Gaza. But that's not what they wanted to do. They want the people gone. And I watched Netanyahu at the UN, it's disgusting to me that he's allowed to come into this country, speak in front of Congress, speak in front of the UN. And a lot of people from the UN walked out. But I watched him hold up 2 maps, and one that said the blessing and one that said the curse. And he said, this is the curse. These countries are the curse. And we can have this land bridge go from Europe through the Middle East, etc. But these countries are the problem. So to me, it's very clear that he wants the land. He wants the area. They want the people there gone. Why do you feel that?
It's genocidal.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, why do you feel that other leaders in the Middle East are not speaking up? I mean, I heard the leader of Turkey criticize Netanyahu and what Israel's doing, but I'm talking specifically more about Jordan, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. What makes them think that they won't be next?
That's a really good question. And look, the US has worked really hard to create a Middle East where as many countries as possible are run by their puppets. Jordan is run by a monarchy. Okay, it's not some like we act like Jordan's like this. Oh my God, Jordan's amazing. The only reason you hear nice things about Jordan is because they don't fight the Israelis, because they're run by a monarchy that benefits and empowers itself and makes a lot of money from basically doing whatever, submitting themselves to US imperialism. And what I mean by that is I mean their entire intelligence infrastructure is basically just an extension of the CIA. They are a horrific, they're a police state. Like everybody complains about Syria as a police state, Assad. They don't actually care, because if they cared about police states and dictatorship, Jordan is a police state and as dictatorship as you get. It's just okay because Jordan is a part of that, like, part of the Middle East that's been sort of like pummeled into submission, and its leaders have been bought off. That's Jordan. It's always been like that. I mean, I'm not a historian, and there's people who can speak to it far better than I can, but even Jordan's founding is like, in collaboration with a monarchy family that the British were like, here you go, you be in charge. And that's how a lot of the Gulf states are. These, I mean, Jordan, Jordan's a little bit different because it has a bigger population, but a lot of these tiny Gulf states are just different monarchy families who like are dictatorships that are products of British Empire. And they basically are put in power and allowed to kind of do whatever they want as long as they submit to US imperialism, particularly by like just basically, letting the US control oil, because a lot of these Gulf states have huge oil reserves. And so these are countries that, they're very self-interested. They're run by like a tiny little mafia group of people. And everything they do is in the name of just kind of capitalism and, supporting US empire because it helps them, until it doesn't. I mean, there are some contradictions starting to take place. Like a lot of these countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they recognize that like a war with Iran, for example, would be very bad for them because they would be targets because they're considered American assets. So they've kind of like already told the US, we're not going to let you use our bases to like target Iran. Like, you do this shit on your own. We don't want anything to do with it. Jordan, though, is even more of like, is even less self-interested because Jordan's just there to like serve the US. I mean, they shoot down Iranian missiles when they're on their way to Israel. They'll do what they basically are, just an extension of America, their government, not their people. A lot of their people are actually Palestinian. But they're not allowed to like really do that much against the government because it's such a horrific, like, controlling police state. And you could say the same about Egypt. I mean, Egypt used to be a source of a lot of resistance in the Middle East. It was like the hotbed of Arab nationalism under Jabal Abdel Nasser, but that all changed from, with US intervention schemes that interfered in Egypt and, empowered sort of the Muslim Brotherhood at one point and other groups. And eventually Egypt was pummeled into submission and did a normalization agreement with the Israelis. And ever since then, I mean, the Egyptian population is very pro-Palestine, but they live in a police state that will arrest and disappear you. So you don't have much coming from there. And then there's also a lot of Arabs, like when it comes to the Arab Street, 2011 with the Arab uprisings, they all became disasters because a lot of outside actors interfered to try to make it go their way. And so you had a lot of wars pop up, you had state collapse happen, and a lot of suffering take place. And people are still kind of traumatized by that. And so there's a lot less willingness today to stand up for anything against those in power than there was maybe 15 years ago. So that's why, I mean, every country in the region has either been bought off, pummeled into submission, or they're currently trying to pummel them into submission. So you take a country like Iran, for example. Iran is like the reason there is a resistance axis in the first place. Iran used to be ruled by the Shah, who was just a dictator, who ran a horrific police state that was fully backed and actually installed by the US and the UK by getting rid in 1953 of a democratically elected leader in Iran, and replacing him with the Shah. And in 1979, Iranians rose up and overthrew the Shah. And then you had the Islamic Revolution. And now you have the Iran we have of today. But after that, I mean, Iran started supporting a lot of non-state actors and then other countries that are also trying to protect their own sovereignty or fight, against imperialism, which is why Iran has a partnership with Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria and the Yemenis. This is what we call the axis of resistance. And this is what I think now, when you see this war extending into Lebanon, this genocide extending into Lebanon, it's not just anymore about Israel destroying Palestinians and stealing their land or destroying Lebanon and stealing its land. It's become much bigger than that. And the Americans are spearheading it. We shouldn't be confused about these stupid statements they keep putting out about, oh, well, we just can't control Israel. There is a neoconservative view that has overtaken those who are in charge in the US, where they believe that now is the time to let Israel take out the entire resistance axis. So let them, look how much they think they've done so well in Gaza just because they've killed like hundreds of thousands of civilians. And Hamas is certainly militarily degraded, though it's still fighting. They haven't actually defeated Hamas. And now they killed Hassan Nasrallah. So they're like high and drunk on victory, false victory, I would say. So they're like, let them go in Lebanon and dismantle Hezbollah, which they can't do, but they think they can. And you know what? Let them take out Iran. Like, you see think pieces by important people who help make policy saying now is the time. We need to take that very seriously. Like, this is like a Iraq war moment, but it's under a Democratic administration, but it doesn't even matter anymore because both parties agree with this insanity.
And then there's the possibility that Russia could get involved if this continues to escalate with Iran. But I feel like this is what Israel wanted all along. As much as the US government continued to say, well, Israel doesn't want a larger war, they don't want war with Iran, and we don't want war with Iran. I don't believe that. On the debate stage recently, Tim Walz and JD Vance, there was something that Tim Walz said that really gave me pause, and it almost went right over my head. But when they were talking about Israel, Tim Walz said the US supports the expansion of Israel. And I said, wait a minute, did he just say the expansion of Israel? And I don't think he meant to say that, but I think it just kind of flew out there.
Yeah.
And then that gave me pause. And I said, this is what I predicted was happening, which was that the US government totally in agreement with what Israel was doing to the Palestinian people. And I think the only reason that we saw Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris call for a ceasefire is because of the large uprising of protest across the world. And that was our message. We were the ones calling for a ceasefire. So I watched them take that word and then they start to use it and say, we need a ceasefire. Then it evolved from we need a ceasefire to we're working tirelessly around the clock for a ceasefire, which didn't make sense. And I think I woke some people up when I said, if you think that's happening, why are they still sending them weapons? If you're working for a ceasefire, why would you still give them weapons? And then Tim Walz just kind of let it all out on the debate stage. And I was like, they support this. Like, the US government supports what Israel's doing. They don't care about those people. They don't care about the kids in Gaza. They don't care about the kids in Lebanon. Like, they totally support this. And it just slipped right out. And I don't know if a lot of people noticed it. How does that make you feel? Because you're Lebanese American. You're in the US right now, but you reside in Lebanon. When you go back and forth between two places, how does it make you feel?
So I'll tell you, I mean, I've lived in Lebanon the last 7 years, I think. So it's been a while. I grew up visiting, but now it's my home. I grew up visiting in the US was my home, but now it's like Lebanon's my home. Beirut is my home. And I mean, look, after October 7th, when Israel started pummeling Gaza, right away, the Israelis were saying, we're going to turn Beirut into Gaza. And there was like a lot of psychological warfare on us in Lebanon. It was really scary. I mean, for those first couple months were really frightening. I had war bags packed. Like, I had three war bags. I had which kind of sounds neurotic, but I'm a bit neurotic like this. I had my backpack. Like, if I need to move quickly, it's got my important things in it, like my documents, my computer, maybe a camera in case I need to take, pictures of things, and like underwear. I don't know. And then I had like a small carry-on in case I needed to evacuate at any point that had a few more things in it. And then I had a big bag, like a big suitcase, because I have a whole village in Lebanon. It's in the mountains, and that's what you do during wars. I mean, every Lebanese is used to Israeli wars, and it's safer to be in the mountains towards the north. So that way I can get in a car, I have things ready, and I'm good for a while. And that's not a normal way to live. And that's easier. Like, I live in a part of Beirut that's considered safe. I mean, so far, though, Israel keeps widening its circle of destruction, and we know that there's not the same rules that there used to be. But that said, I mean, airstrikes are really scary. This is a country that's currently committing a genocide. And there's people who live in what would be considered the first areas Israel would bomb. And they were living in, it's like it's scarier if you live in those places, like in a southern village or in South Beirut, where they're currently pummeling every night several residential buildings and turning them to rubble with like 15-minute evacuation notices on X. So this is how the Lebanese have been living the last year. Every time, I do travel quite a bit. I'm usually like, I've been to Venezuela since then. I've been to the US a bunch of times. I've gone to other parts of the Middle East. I've gone to Europe. So like I do travel, every couple months, let's say. So every time I travel, I leave my apartment with the thought in my mind that I might get it stuck outside and not come back. So let me make sure I take certain things with me I might need if I can't come back because a war breaks out and they bomb the airport. Um, that's also not a normal way to live. But this is what Lebanese people have been dealing with for a year. And again, amidst comments, statements by Israeli government officials like every other day. One was, Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, at one point said, take the map of Gaza and overlay it on Beirut, and that's what we're going to do soon. And this is just what people have heard over and over again, but it became kind of normal. And the reason I'm even saying all this is because I think that it became normal for us that this seemed to become like a manageable thing where there was a simmering hot war at the border that every once in a while turned into like a targeted airstrike somewhere, but you could sort of live with that and navigate it and still feel somewhat safe. Like life was going on normal, business as usual, not like it is in the last few weeks. And I think that the Israelis, like now they're dealing with being hit with rockets from Yemen, from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Iran now, right? Like serious ballistic missiles from Iran. Had this happened a year ago, I think Israelis would be freaking out more, but it's kind of that boiling frog situation where everybody becomes okay with certain things to the point where they're willing to escalate more. So now the Israelis are willing to escalate more because they've learned to live with this at least. And I think the same goes for the Americans. For several months until the last couple of months, there were red lines on Lebanon for Israel. The Americans had constrained them on Lebanon with a fear that this would turn into a regional war that they don't want to be involved in. Because Hezbollah is a powerful, powerful force. And they're not a state. They don't have bunker buster bombs, but they can do a lot of damage to Israel and in some cases to US assets in the region or their allies can. But I think because this has gone on a year, the Americans have come to the conclusion that they can manage this. And they're okay with dealing with the risks now. Like maybe they weren't a year ago, but now it's like, this isn't actually as bad as we thought it would be. We can handle we have, Israel has an Iron Dome. We can handle our guys being hit a couple times here and there and just reinforce our defenses. We can deal with all these different groups targeting us and the Israelis. And it's even worth it if it means in the long run, we can take out Iran. And so that's where everyone's at now. But listen, living in Lebanon has been terrible in the sense of feeling terrorized, but I did get used to it. It's a lovely place. Like my life is there. My friends are there. All I want to do is go back there. But like, now over 1 million people are displaced. This is a really tiny country. It's a country of 6 million people. More than a sixth of the population, 1.2 million, is displaced from their homes. This is like catastrophic. And this is a country that was already dealing with an economic collapse. Israel is dropping. I actually want to read you this statistic. I was like blown away. There's this article in some US Navy magazine written by an Air Force guy talking about those 80 bunker buster bombs that were dropped on South Beirut to kill Hassan Nasrallah. And he's like kind of like in awe. He's like, wow, Israel's appetite for collateral damage is a lot higher than America's. But it's interesting and lessons should be learned. And he goes on to say, according to a US Air Force Central Command report on the 2003 invasion of Iraq, US Air Forces expended a total of 24 bunker busters in the entire conflict against the Iraqi military. 24. Last Friday, Israel dropped up to 3 times as many weapons in one night. That was the night they killed Hassan Nasrallah. So like, this is a new level of depravity, a new level of accepting like hundreds of people killed in a single strike. And it's terrifying. Like it is after watching Gaza for a year and seeing the constraints have been taken off the Israelis to seemingly do whatever they want. I am so scared for my family. I am so scared for my friends. And it just seems like there's no one who can stop this.
I feel the same way. There's been a lot of focus in the US, particularly on the state of Michigan for the 2024 presidential election. Large Muslim population. And it was also recently brought to my attention there's over 80,000 Lebanese Americans that live in Michigan as well. In a recent poll from CARE, and this was, I think this one has given the Democratic Party like shockwaves. But in a recent poll from CARE, it is showing that in Michigan and some other swing states as well, but in Michigan right now, Jill Stein is beating Kamala Harris with Muslim voters. She has about 40%. Also, I believe Arizona, and I think the other one was Wisconsin with the Muslim vote in particular. This is where I think, some of us that came from like the Bernie movement, there is a divide right now that's happening there. There was a divide during Force the Vote. Now there's another divide over this particular issue. And the reality is, from what I see based on the numbers, she is going to have a very difficult time. Kamala is going to have a very difficult time trying to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona just based on the Muslim vote alone. Some people have decided that people should still support her because Trump's going to be worst in the Middle East. My whole statement is that, considering everything that happened over the year, the genocide, Gaza, also the land expansion in the West Bank, which oftentimes the West Bank is not mentioned by corporate media as much, because with that one, how can you say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself? So there's that, now Lebanon, and then there's this war with Iran. So there are some of us that have decided, we're going to support third party. We're not going to support Biden, Kamala, or Donald Trump. And now there is like this rift again where I feel like I go back to Bernie 2016. And there was a good segment of people that said, we're going to go over and vote for Jill Stein. And then there were some Bernie supporters that said, Donald Trump's a threat. We're going to support Bernie Sanders. And sometimes I go back to that moment and I wonder what would have happened if all of us, including Bernie, would have held the line, because Hillary Clinton lost anyway. And for me, like when I think about this issue of genocide and the hurricanes, I don't know if you heard about the hurricanes that just happened here in the US, but it has been announced they're giving them $750, giving the hurricane victims $750. And I've watched billions of dollars go to Israel and Ukraine. And it's just for years now, Zelensky can walk into Congress and walk out with a big fat check. Yep. And the American people are left behind. How do you feel about that? Like where the voters feel, particularly those that are Muslim voters, but not just Muslim voters, also Arab American voters that are not Muslim, but they're Arab American.
I mean, at this point, I think it's really hard to make the argument to people whose families are being massacred that there's a lesser evil. Like what? I'm sorry. My family being massacred is the lesser evil. You're really going to try to convince me with a gun to my head to vote for somebody who is not only arming the people, destroying the lives of those that I love and my homeland, but on top of that is promising to continue to do it. Right? Like everything's about Israel's right to self-defense, which is not self-defense. Sorry. Bombing, not sorry. Sorry, not sorry. Bombing every country in your neighborhood is not self-defense. It's absolute insanity. And anybody else, it's their right to self-defense against you to be hitting you back. Lebanon has the right to defend itself against an invading force. Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against genocide. Iran has the right to retaliate when its sovereignty is violated and Israel bombs Tehran. Like that's self-defense, internationally speaking, and just morally speaking. But I mean, it's just explain to me how, like, I get it. If you're American, you don't have family in Lebanon or Gaza or anywhere in the Middle East, and this doesn't affect you. Sure, there's these nuances between these parties. I'm not going to pretend there isn't, but really, like, okay, that to me just means it's okay for everybody else to just die in other parts of the world. And also this country keeps moving to the right anyway. So as far as Arab American voters go, a significant chunk of them are not going to vote for the people that are destroying their families' lives. They're just not. They're going to vote third party. They're obviously, no one's happy about Trump. Like, would Trump be any worse or better on this? I actually don't know because he's not in charge. Do I want him to be in charge? No. I also don't want these people to be in charge. I'm also just like, These people need to be punished. They are carrying out a genocide. I refuse to be put into a position where I am forced to choose between different flavors of Hitler, Hitler light and Hitler. Like, I refuse to participate in that. I absolutely refuse. And you know what? It is not, the onus is not on me or my community to vote for Democrats because we don't want a Republican elected. The onus is on the Democratic Party to not genocide my people. That's
Yeah.
it. That's it. And they have chosen to continue to genocide my people. And really, worst case scenario for me, for where I live, what the fuck, excuse my language, but what the fuck is worse than genocide? Like, I don't know what to tell you. So at the end of the day, I also think we need to think beyond electoral politics. I mean, we know a third party is not going to win. I'm not delusional. I know a third party is not going to win, but this is a huge galvanizing moment because people, you don't have to be from Lebanon or Gaza to be horrified and to be devastated by what we're seeing. Because I don't care where this is happening. I don't care if it was happening in Latin America, somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Asia. I would be horrified and not okay with the people carrying it out. And they need to be punished. If they win after this, what can't they do?
Yeah. Yeah, I was watching this podcast called The Thinking Muslim, and they were talking about this particular issue. And one of the guests on the show said that, like, you're basically going to let them, if you let them get away with this, it's like, it's just I don't know. To me, when I look at electoral politics, particularly when it comes to Israel, it's very obvious that both parties are pro-Israel. A lot of that has to do with AIPAC and the Israeli lobby. And I think what's interesting when you mentioned Ronald Reagan, why do you think it is that Ronald Reagan was able to say, wait a minute, this is too much. Let me make a phone call. Stop what you're doing. What was so different then, and why do you feel those in charge can't do it now? And Ronald Reagan was a Republican.
I don't think those in charge want it to end. There's definitely, we know there's like disagreements inside the Biden administration. There's like, some internal uprising that for whatever reason has manifested into nothing inside the State Department, inside the Defense Department. I'm not sure why these people just don't resign because nothing they have to say internally has changed anything. But there is a decision. I think it's beyond AIPAC. Yes, AIPAC does a good job policing and keeping members of Congress and American officials in line and like whatever else, politically in the country that exists, media in line, for sure. But I think there's also an ideological collaboration between the Israelis and the Americans. Look, the Israelis exist as an American proxy state to do the dirty work oftentimes that America won't do. I'll take Latin America as an example. There's a whole history of Israel and Latin America stepping in and like basically arming the fascists in this or that country when the US can't because of an arms embargo. They work together like this. And so we really need to look at what Israel's doing as, yes, there are contradictions. Like the US would be happy if Israel would agree to some like stupid two-state solution that isn't really liberation for anybody. It's just more apartheid because it would, make it more manageable for them. But at the same time, the US doesn't really care about Palestine. They have different, like whatever, Israel wants to take more land, fine, whatever. At the end of the day, this is their bully in the region. And they are now, like, when you hear Biden make these statements like, no, we don't want Israel to hit Iranian nuclear facilities. I'm like, actually, are you just saying that for plausible deniability? Like, I believe at this point they are. Like all of this, like, oh, we're pulling Israel back. Explain to me how you're pulling Israel back when you're still arming them. And you actually have the same military objectives as them. The US does want to dismantle and take down Hezbollah. The US does want to dismantle and take down Hamas. The US does want to overthrow the Iranian government. Like these are ambitions of the US. And you know what? It seems like Israel's on a winning streak. Why not let them go all the way and see what happens? That's the mentality that I believe has gripped DC. So I think it goes beyond AIPAC at this point. It's a matter of the US or those in charge, people like Brett McGurk, people like Amos Hochstein, people like Jake Sullivan. These are the people advising the president. And we actually know from a political article from a few days ago that Brett McGurk, who's like a special Middle East envoy, and has been for a very long time in both parties, serving both parties. and Amos Hochstein, who's a special presidential advisor that's been acting as an interlocutor between the Lebanese and the Israelis for the last several years under the Biden administration. These guys, while publicly they were saying, yeah, we're trying to put together a ceasefire to de-escalate in the north and Lebanon south, it turns out they were actually telling Joe Biden and advising Joe Biden and his team that we should let the Israelis go after Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's time. They have the capability to do it. So this is not, like, we have to stop seeing this as like Israel's just dragging America, because it really lets the Americans off the hook. The same people who did the Iraq War, the same people who after that decided it was a great idea to overthrow the government in Libya and collapse that state and bring back slavery, the same people who spent years trying to overthrow the government in Syria and brought about the rise of ISIS and Al Qaeda, who I thought were supposed to be like our enemies or something, but then they're our friends when we want them to be. These same people are psychotic enough and arrogant enough to think they can do whatever they want in Iran. These are America's enemies in the region. America's entire goal in the Middle East, as the rest of the world, is to control all the resources to the benefit of the American ruling class. And countries like Iran and groups like Hezbollah and groups like Hamas and the Yemenis, they are obstacles to that full throttle domination. And so this is seen as an opportunity by the Americans to get rid of all of that resistance to imperialism. And they're willing to sacrifice the lives of millions of people to make that happen, which shows you how psychotic and delusional they are.
I 100% agree. It's just insane. I really can't believe it's been almost a year. In the next couple of days, it's been almost a year since October 7th. I honestly did not think that this would go on for as long as it has.
Neither did I.
Um, but here we are. So, Rania, one more question for you, because again, I think a lot of Americans just don't know. It's been very clear to me that a lot of Americans assume that everyone in the Middle East is, except for Israel, is Muslim. That is obviously not the case. What is something about Lebanon that you could tell people that you think a lot of people probably don't know?
I mean, I hate to go with this Orientalist stereotype or playing into it, but someone tweeted out like a couple weeks ago this ridiculous thing about, here's a photo at a Lebanese beach from before Hezbollah existed. And it was like people in bikinis. And I'm just like, okay, not that it makes it okay to do anything horrific to Gaza because it's a more conservative society, but I think anybody who goes to like Beirut falls in love with it. It's a really charming city that's actually quite Western. Like, I spend most of my time at the beach and the pool because it's a beautiful coastal city and a beautiful like coastal country with also mountains. People go skiing. Lebanon is super geographically diverse and beautiful. Its culture is awesome. It's a party place. I mean, I'm not a big party person, but people love to go party in Lebanon. Nobody knows how to party like the Lebanese. And there's a lot of diversity there. Everyone thinks all Arabs are Muslims. Not that there's anything wrong with Muslims, but actually, like, my family is not Muslim. I mean, I'm not religious. I'm a secular person, but like, my family is not Muslim. We're from a minority sect. There's a lot of Christians in Lebanon as well. Not that that's makes it okay, like, to do what you're doing to a country just because Christians aren't there, but there's lots of Christians in Lebanon, and they have beautiful mountain villages. And like, you know, all these Western white correspondents who come to Lebanon like fall in love with it because they can like relate to it so much, which is probably one of the few things that's going to make it like harder in terms of propaganda for Israel to dehumanize. Like, Lebanese are dehumanized as all being human shields for Hezbollah. But once you actually like look at Lebanon, it's like, well, that doesn't, like, not that anyone's human shields for anyone, but white people, when they can relate to people more, they feel like they're more human. So because Lebanon has a sort of like secular side and a sort of like Western cultural side to it, those sort of white correspondents, their souls hurt a bit more when Lebanon is ruined. And so do like American diplomats, by the way. And so do the French. I mean, the French have this weird paternalistic relationship with Lebanon because they were the colonial rulers for a bit. So they're very upset about what's happening. They're just completely powerless to stop it. But anyways, Lebanon's a fantastic place. It's full of so much culture. We have some Roman ancient ruins in an area called Baalbek that I'm really worried Israel's going to bomb. Anyone who's ever been to Baalbek will tell you that it's actually like nicer than any ruins you'll see in Italy. The ruins are incredible. Oh my God, it's like incredible and so well preserved and just like massive and also not full of like obnoxious white tourists. So you can like walk around with more ease. But no, like Lebanon's just like an amazing, wonderful place that hasn't been allowed to breathe. Or everyone's always like, well, why didn't they build and develop properly? And it's like, because there's a psychotic neighbor constantly trying to steal its land and constantly threatening war. And you know what's amazing is despite that, Lebanon does manage to persevere. And also, when it comes to the issue of resistance, I'll also add that the people who are resisting invaders and occupiers under really harsh conditions, they're dealing with the most well-armed military power in the region. Israel has access to all the resources that America has access to. Despite having all that, these people who are like under sanction and have to operate like underground, literally, have managed to put up a strong enough fight to protect their people to the best of their ability. And I think that's something to really look at and watch, especially as we see some pretty epic battles playing out as we speak in South Lebanon with these various Hezbollah units fending off these psychotic genocidal monsters. We saw what they did in Gaza. And you know what? For the last year, the only reason that you don't see rape dungeons across Lebanon the way they've created in Palestine is because of Hezbollah. So it stands to be seen what will happen. But I mean, I love Lebanon so much. Anybody who's visited there can tell you the same. And I just really hope that this is like not going to become a Gaza situation because I don't think I can handle it. I really don't.
Rania Khalek, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.